What if the fate of an entire continent could be shaken before the sun had even risen? At 5:42 the gray silence of dawn, two missiles cut across the skies of Yatenga. They did not carry peace. They carried fire. In a single strike, 3 lives were lost, 2 soldiers guarding their post, and 1 woman whose home crumbled beneath the blast. 7 more lay wounded. A communications tower, the only link for thousands, was turned into dust. And when the smoke lifted, it was not just debris that filled the air. It was the scent of violation of a people's sovereignty, torn apart by hands that did not even live on their soil. The world was told this was security. But Africans knew it for what it was, a reminder that power still sought to dictate their destiny. Yet from the ashes rose a voice stronger than steel. A young captain stepped forward, his words steady, his eyes unflinching. Africa bows to no one. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that no longer bows its head. At 5:42 the morning, when the horizon of Yatenga still held the quiet gray promise of dawn, the world changed. The silence was shattered by the roar of engines, followed by 2 streaks of fire cutting across the sky. They moved faster than the eye could follow. A heartbeat later, the ground shook as precision-guided missiles tore through their targets with surgical force. The lone communications tower of the province crumbled first, its steel frame twisting into smoke and rubble. Moments later, the small military outpost beside it was engulfed in flames. In a matter of seconds, what had been a symbol of connection and protection was reduced to ash. The cost was not only structural. 2 soldiers, barely awake from their barracks, lost their lives before fastening their boots. A woman in a nearby home, her mourning yet to begin, was crushed under the weight of collapsing walls. 7 others were pulled from the debris, wounded and crying out in pain. Their voices carried across the wind like a haunting chorus, the sound of a people thrust into chaos without warning. By mid-morning, the truth had emerged through the haze of dust and smoke. This was no accident. The Ministry of Defense confirmed that the missiles had been launched from a United States military installation in Niger, more than 380 miles away. No consultation, no request for consent, no warning, a unilateral decision, executed in violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which forbids such acts against the sovereignty of nations. The government in Ouagadougou responded swiftly. President Captain Ibrahim Traore appeared before the nation in his familiar camouflage fatigues, the Burkina Faso flag behind him. His face was resolute, his tone unyielding. This strike was not merely against our land, he declared. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people. In that single broadcast, carried across radios and televisions to more than 8 million citizens, the narrative began to shift. What was meant to intimidate had instead sparked defiance. From the villages of Yatenga to the streets of the capital, whispers grew into chants. Farmers, students, workers, and elders repeated the words they had just heard. Africa bows to no one. The military raised its alert level. 12,000 active duty troops were placed on standby. Border security along the Mali and Niger frontiers was reinforced with hundreds of soldiers. At airbases and garrisons, readiness climbed to the equivalent of DEFCON 2. But even as soldiers took positions, the first true wave of response did not come from the army. It came from the people. In the aftermath of destruction, there was fear. Yes, but more than fear, there was resolve. Women carried food and water to strangers in need. Children painted armbands in the national colors. Men gathered in circles, speaking of dignity, of history, of how their fathers had once stood against colonial might. The strike that shook the dawn had lit more than fires of destruction. It had ignited the fire of unity, and as the sun finally rose over Yatenga, its light revealed not only rubble, but the beginning of something larger. The attack had been meant to break a people's spirit. Instead, It marked the birth of a defiance that would echo far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. By late afternoon, Revolution Square in Ouagadougou had transformed into something more than stone and open ground. It had become a sea of voices, a storm of color, a living heartbeat of defiance. The estimated number was 35,000. But anyone who stood there that day would tell you it felt like more. Flags unfurled in the dry wind. Drums pounded in rhythms that had once carried warriors into battle. Songs of resistance echoed deep into the night, their melodies weaving old memory with new determination. Men stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Women offered water and bread to any hand that reached out. Children held painted signs, their letters uneven but their message clear. Our land, our right, our future. What began as grief and outrage had become something else, a movement. A people who had been expected to cower under the weight of a superpower's strike instead rose as one. The air was electric. Among the crowd stood veterans who had once fought in battles decades ago, their uniforms worn but their pride unbroken. Beside them were students who had never known war, yet who shouted with voices as fierce as any fighter. This unity across generations was not planned. It was instinctive. When sovereignty is attacked, memory itself rises to defend it. Across West Africa, social media carried the images outward. In Lagos, Dakar, and Nairobi, hashtags repeated the same defiant phrases: our land, our right, our future. The chant spread like wildfire. Beyond borders, beyond languages. What happened in Burkina Faso was no longer only Burkina Faso's struggle. It was becoming Africa's. International media could not ignore the sight. Regional networks broadcast the images within hours. In Accra, in Nairobi, live panels debated. Was this strike a calculated show of force meant to discourage nations from stepping away from Western partnerships? Or was it a blunder that had instead accelerated the Pan-African unity movement? In Washington, officials repeated the language of counterterrorism. They claimed the strike had neutralized a militant cell plotting attacks against U.S. assets in the Sahel. But when journalists pressed for names, dates, or evidence, the silence spoke louder than the words. No photographs, no details, no proof. For many Africans, this was a familiar script. The same justifications used time and again to mask intervention with the cloak of security. But this time, the people were not buying it. In Ouagadougou, citizens stayed up late into the night. Radios tuned to call-in programs. Callers voiced both fear and courage. If they can strike us today, one said, they can strike anyone tomorrow. We must stand together now, or we will stand alone later. By the end of that first day, the intended intimidation had clearly backfired. Captain Ibrahim, or Traore, as many now called him with both familiarity and reverence, was no longer just a national leader. He was fast becoming a continental symbol. International analysts began to describe the Captain Ibrahim latest news as carrying weight far beyond Burkina Faso. The people's power was not only in their numbers, it was in their spirit. And that spirit carried outward in waves. In Bamako, Mali, 50,000 marched down Independence Avenue, waving Burkinabe flags alongside their own. In Conakry, Guinea, a candlelight vigil honored the 3 lives lost. Even in Nairobi, a city with deep ties to the United States, protesters carried signs demanding African unity. For decades, Africa had been told its voice was weak, its divisions too deep, its sovereignty negotiable. But on that night, under the stars of Ouagadougou, 35,000 voices proved otherwise. They showed that unity is not a dream. It is a force, and in the rhythm of the drums, in the chants of the crowd, in the defiant glow of torches, a message carried across the Sahel. Burkina Faso will not bow. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. By the next morning, the shock waves of the Yatenga strike had traveled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union stirred with urgency. Within just 18 hours, an emergency session was called, one of the fastest in AU history. Foreign ministers from 42 African nations joined a secure virtual summit. Some spoke from offices in capital cities, others from hastily arranged rooms. But the message repeated. Delegation after delegation was clear. This is not just Burkina Faso's problem. This is Africa's problem. When the image of President Ibrahim Traore appeared on the giant screen, the room fell into silence. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, his voice carrying the calm defiance of a man who had already decided his course. If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, he said, then none of us are safe. Burkina Faso will not stand alone, and neither should you. The impact was immediate. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, each led by governments that had recently stepped away from Western influence, condemned the strike in the strongest terms. Senegal and Ghana, more traditionally aligned with Washington, urged the United States to explain itself and to respect African sovereignty. For once, the divide between aligned and independent blurred under the weight of common concern. In Bamako, 50,000 people filled Independence Avenue, waving Burkinabe flags beside their Malian colors. In Conakry, Guinea, citizens held a candlelight vigil. Even in Nairobi, a city with deep American ties, protesters marched with signs reading, "Africa Unites." The chant was spreading across languages and borders. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Pentagon described the operation as a targeted anti-terror mission. Officials claimed it had eliminated a militant cell plotting attacks. But when pressed for evidence, they offered none. No photographs, no names, no intelligence briefings. To African ears, it was the same old song, the language of intervention, dressed as security. At the United Nations in New York, Burkina Faso's ambassador demanded an emergency Security Council meeting. The debate lasted more than 3 hours. African representatives challenged U.S. officials directly on legality and precedent. Russia and China condemned the strike as a breach of international law. France, unwilling to alienate Washington but also careful not to appear complicit, called for restraint on all sides. Many Africans read that as nothing more than a diplomatic dodge. The media split along predictable lines. African outlets emphasized sovereignty, dignity, and the voices of the people. Western coverage leaned heavily on the narrative of instability and terrorism. But online, the story was different. African commentators accused global media of downplaying the truth. Social platforms amplified voices of ordinary citizens who had seen the rubble, buried their dead, and carried the wounded. And then something unexpected happened. Countries that rarely agreed on anything, Algeria and South Africa, among them, issued a joint statement defending Burkina Faso's right to self-defense. Brazil and Malaysia added their voices, warning of the dangerous precedent such strikes could set if left unchallenged. Perhaps the most telling response came not from governments but from the African diaspora. In Paris, London, and New York, Pan-African groups organized rallies. Speakers denounced the attack as colonialism in a new uniform. For them, the issue was not just Burkina Faso. It was a pattern repeated across more than a century. What the missiles destroyed in Yatenga was a tower of steel. But what they awakened was a tower of solidarity. Rising from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the strike meant to silence a people had, instead, given them a louder voice. And as analysts noted, across newsrooms and think tanks, the Burkina Faso latest news was no longer a local headline. It was a continental reckoning. In the days that followed, Ouagadougou became a city with two faces. On one side, it was a fortress. Checkpoints multiplied. Soldiers patrolled airports and ministries, and more than 4,000 additional troops secured communication hubs and borders. On the other side, it was a rally ground squares, filled with chanting voices. Murals appeared on walls, and songs of resistance spilled from radios and marketplaces. The government moved swiftly to stabilize the nation. Emergency measures secured imports of grain and fuel, though diesel prices still rose by 12% within a week. Food prices in northern provinces climbed by nearly 10%. Parents in Wahiguya kept children home from school, fearful of another strike. The question whispered in homes and shouted on radio lines was the same. What protections do we have if another missile comes? President Traore's administration responded with town halls, nightly broadcasts, and visible outreach. Ministers traveled to affected provinces, listening, explaining, reassuring. On television, the president's words were firm. This strike was not just against our soil. It was against our right to exist. If the attack was meant to break public faith, it had failed. Polls showed his approval rating surge from 62% to 78%. In a nation long accustomed to external interference, the image of a young captain defying a superpower carried a weight deeper than politics. It was dignity restored. Meanwhile, the international stage turned volatile. At the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, lawmakers demanded explanations. Senator Mark Rutland of Illinois warned, "If we are conducting military strikes in sovereign nations without consent, we are on a dangerous path, morally and strategically." The Pentagon tried to reframe the operation as intelligence-driven, but leaks revealed neither Burkina Faso nor the African Union had been consulted. Human rights groups called it unlawful. Policy experts called it reckless. Across Europe, reactions split. France called for dialogue while avoiding sharp criticism of Washington. Germany bluntly warned, partnerships cannot survive without trust. Russia and China seized the moment, denouncing neo-imperialism and offering open support to Burkina Faso. Media coverage reflected these divides. CNN and Fox focused on the alleged terror threat. NPR and The Intercept questioned legality. African media kept sovereignty at the center, replaying Traore's speeches and images of solidarity rallies. Analysts from Brussels to Washington asked the same question. Has the U.S. underestimated the backlash? Burkina Faso's government began recalibrating foreign policy. Joint training with U.S. forces was scaled down. Cooperation agreements with Western nations were placed under review. At the same time, quiet but deliberate steps were taken toward non-Western partners. Within weeks, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed the Sahel Shield Alliance, pledging mutual defense if one was attacked without consent. The others would respond collectively. It was more than a treaty. It was a warning. Observers noted that the creation of the Sahel Shield was a direct challenge to American and French influence in the region. Algeria hosted closed-door talks on wider African security cooperation. Proposals for pooled African funding for homegrown military equipment began to circulate. For Washington, the consequences were immediate access to Sahelian leaders dropped to the lowest level in 2 decades. Inside Burkina Faso, Traore's popularity climbed higher still. Polls from the Ouagadougou Institute of Public Opinion reported 82% approval for his foreign policy. Citizens cited national dignity and African unity as their top reasons. For much of Africa's modern history, leaders who resisted Western dominance often found themselves isolated or removed from power. But after the strike, Traore was breaking that pattern, not with empty slogans, but with action that could be measured. Alliances signed, troops mobilized, contracts rewritten. International analysts who once dismissed him as a transitional figure now began describing him as a continental force. And across the diaspora, from Harlem to Brixton, his name was spoken with the weight once reserved for historic freedom fighters. The world had entered a new game. The missiles that tore through Yatenga had not only destroyed a tower, they had shifted the balance of global power. 2 months after the strike on Yatenga, the crisis took a dramatic turn. In neighboring Niger, a drone entered without permission and released fire on a small village. 4 civilians were killed. The justification was the same phrase Africans had heard countless times before: counter-terrorism operation. But to the people, It looked exactly like what had just happened in Burkina Faso. Within 24 hours, Niger's interim leadership reached out to President Ibrahim Traore. Their request was simple yet historic, a joint statement of defiance. The next day, the two leaders stood side by side in Niamey. Cameras rolled as they declared together, "The era of unilateral foreign strikes in Africa is over." For millions across the continent, this was more than words. It was a vision long dreamed of but rarely seen: African leaders united, shoulder to shoulder, against outside interference. The effect was immediate. Mali, Guinea, and Chad issued similar declarations. In East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda voiced their support. Even in countries traditionally tied to the West, parliamentary debates erupted about whether foreign military bases should remain without strict oversight. Across the Sahel, the phrase began to take shape: Africa's shield. In market stalls, vendors spoke of it as if it already existed. On social media, hashtags like #Africa Unites and #Sahel Strong spread like wildfire. In Washington, Pentagon analysts sounded the alarm. A visible alliance of African nations openly rejecting Western military operations could restrict U.S. presence in the region for years. In Paris, defense officials privately admitted that the momentum of African unity was far stronger than they had anticipated. Traore understood the weight of the moment. He was careful not to use words that could escalate conflict, but he never softened his core message: Africa's sovereignty is not negotiable. Behind the scenes, his government moved to turn symbolic unity into concrete cooperation. Draft plans for Sahel Shield joint exercises circulated. Proposals for shared intelligence networks and coordinated border patrols gained traction. Economic policy was also shifting. Traore's administration fast-tracked reforms, ensuring that mining contracts, especially in gold and manganese, prioritized national benefit over foreign profit. Aid threatened with suspension by Western donors was quietly replaced by new streams from African and Asian partners. The feared economic collapse never came. Instead, resilience grew. At the African Union Extraordinary Summit in Addis Ababa, Traore, the youngest head of state in the room, walked alongside leaders twice his age. In his familiar camouflage fatigues, he spoke not as a soldier, but as a statesman. Sovereignty is not a gift, he told the assembly. It is a responsibility, and it belongs to those willing to defend it. His words carried beyond the walls of the AU. In the streets of Ouagadougou, people repeated them like a song. In Bamako's cafes, they were quoted over tea. In Nairobi's marketplaces, they were spoken with pride. For Africans at home and abroad, this was a moment long denied: the sight of young leaders refusing to bow. What was meant to isolate Burkina Faso had, instead, ignited a continental movement. Burkina Faso's story was no longer just its own. It was Africa's. It was about reclaiming dignity, asserting destiny, and refusing silence. The fire had begun in Yatenga, but now it was spreading from the Sahel to the southern tip of the continent and beyond, into the hearts of Africans across the diaspora. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Burkina Faso's story is not yet finished. The road ahead will be long, lined with pressure from outside powers who fear a self-reliant Africa. Economic threats will come, diplomatic tricks will be played, and there will be those who still believe Africa must bow. But what happened after the missiles struck Yatenga has already changed the course of history. Instead of bending, a small nation stood. Instead of breaking, it reached for its neighbors. And instead of silence, it gave the world a new voice, a voice carried by Captain Ibrahim, echoed by millions, and strengthened by the Sahel Shield Alliance. This was never just about one tower destroyed or one border crossed. It was about dignity, about the right to decide who enters African skies, who touches African soil, and who writes Africa's future. That right belongs not to Washington, not to Paris, but to Africans themselves. In Harlem and Nairobi, in Bamako and Johannesburg, in Paris and Kingston, The diaspora feels the same heartbeat. Africa bows to no one. If this story moves something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Say it with me, New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa. The struggle will not end with one speech or one march, but every chant, every flag lifted, every voice raised brings us closer to the Africa our ancestors dreamed of. And when the world asks whether Africa can stand, the answer must thunder from every corner of the globe. Yes, we stand together, and we bow to no one. Stay with us because the story of Burkina Faso is now the story of Africa itself. Captain Ibrahim, latest news is not only about a young soldier rising, it is about a continent refusing to kneel. Burkina Faso latest news is not only about one nation's resistance, it is about a people choosing freedom over fear. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.